He pretended to be a servant until he heard her plan for their marriage, 1964. The rain came down in sheets that October evening, turning the circular driveway of the Hartwell estate into a mirror that reflected the Georgian mansion's illuminated windows. James Montgomery pulled the collar of his wool coat higher as he stepped off the Greyhound bus at the edge of Lexington, Kentucky, his leather suitcase heavy in his hand. Everything he owned that mattered, which wasn't much anymore, fit inside that single bag. He'd left Boston 3 days ago with nothing but a fake reference letter, $20, and a burning need to disappear from the life his father had mapped out for him since birth. Montgomery Steel wasn't just a company, it was a dynasty, a prison of expectations where James was meant to be the dutiful heir, marry Elizabeth Ashford from the neighboring industrial family, and perpetuate a merger disguised as matrimony. The thought made his stomach turn. Before we continue with James's story, I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to our channel and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to connect with you. The want ad had been simple. Estate household staff needed, room and board included. Apply in person. Mrs. Patricia Hartwell ran one of the most respected horse breeding operations in the Bluegrass State, and her late husband had left her with more money than she could spend, but not enough help to maintain the sprawling property. James had never mucked a stall or polished silver in his life, but he'd spent the bus ride memorizing the lies he'd need to tell. His name was James Monroe now, no relation to the president, just a drifter looking for honest work. The housekeeper, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Fletcher, hired him on the spot. She was desperate, she admitted, with the Derby season approaching and half the staff having left for better-paying factory work in Louisville. James learned quickly that working at the Hartwell estate meant early mornings, aching muscles, and a kind of invisibility he'd never experienced. When you wore work clothes and carried a bucket, wealthy people looked right through you, which is exactly how he wanted it. Victoria Hartwell stood at her bedroom window on the second floor, watching the new groundskeeper trim the hedges near the rose garden. There was something peculiar about him, the way he moved, perhaps, or the fact that he held the pruning shears like they were foreign objects. She'd noticed him 3 weeks ago when he'd first arrived, drenched and desperate-looking, and something in his eyes had caught her attention. Not that it mattered. Victoria's life was already planned out, every detail negotiated like a business contract. In 6 months she would marry Theodore Buckley III, the son of her mother's oldest friend and the heir to a Louisville bourbon empire. The engagement would be announced at the Christmas gala. The wedding would take place in June at Christ Church Cathedral. They would honeymoon in Europe. She would produce the required heirs. The end. At 23, Victoria should have been thrilled. Theodore was handsome in a conventional way, well-educated and perfectly suitable. He was also boring as unbuttered toast and had the emotional depth of a teacup. Their courtship had consisted of chaperoned dinners where he discussed bourbon barrel aging and she pretended to find it fascinating. "Miss Victoria." Her mother's voice came from the doorway, sharp and expectant. Patricia Hartwell was a woman who had married well, buried her husband young, and transformed grief into an iron will that controlled everything within her sphere of influence. "Theodore will be here for dinner at 7. Please wear the blue dress. It brings out your eyes." "Yes, Mother." Victoria kept her gaze on the window, on the mysterious groundskeeper who was now struggling with the hedge trimmer. She bit back a smile. He had absolutely no idea what he was doing. Patricia crossed the room, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "I know this isn't a love match, darling, but love is overrated. Security, position, family, those things endure. The Buckleys are good people. You'll learn to be content." Content. The word settled over Victoria like a wool blanket on a summer day, suffocating and unnecessary. James had been at the estate for a month when he first heard Victoria's voice up close. He'd been cleaning the library windows, trying not to leave streaks, when she entered with her mother and Theodore Buckley. The library door was ajar, and their voices carried clearly as they settled into the leather chairs near the fireplace. "The wedding date is set," Patricia announced. "June 15th. Reverend Morrison has already confirmed." James froze, spray bottle in hand. "That's wonderful, Patricia." Theodore's voice had the smooth, empty quality of someone who'd grown up saying the right things. "Victoria, darling, I've arranged for us to tour the Buckley estate next weekend. You'll need to familiarize yourself with the house staff and the property management." There was a pause. Then Victoria's voice, quieter than the others. "I'd like that." But James heard what the others apparently didn't. The hollow note of resignation, the careful modulation of someone speaking lines they'd rehearsed but didn't believe. "Now, about the prenuptial agreement," Patricia continued. "Our lawyers have prepared the documents. The Hartwell breeding stock will remain under separate trust, naturally, and the estate will pass to your children, not the Buckley holdings." "Of course," Theodore agreed. "My father insists on similar protections for our distillery operations. This is a merger of families, not assets." James's hand tightened on the window frame. A merger. That's exactly what his own father had called his arranged engagement to Elizabeth Ashford. The words were almost identical. "I want to be clear about something." Victoria's voice had changed, gaining an edge. "I'll fulfill my duties as a wife, Theodore, but I won't be decorative. I intend to continue managing the breeding program and expanding our operations. The Hartwell name meant something to my father, and it will continue to mean something." "Victoria," her mother started. "I'm not negotiating this point," Victoria interrupted, and James caught his breath at the steel in her tone. "If Theodore wants a society wife who hosts luncheons and joins garden clubs, he should look elsewhere. I'm a businesswoman, and I'll remain one." Theodore laughed, but it sounded uncertain. "Of course, darling. I admire your spirit. We can certainly discuss your hobbies after we're married." "Hobbies?" James winced. "My work is not a hobby." Victoria's chair scraped against the floor, and James heard her stand. "Excuse me, I need some air." She swept out of the library before anyone could respond, her footsteps rapid on the marble floor of the main hall. James quickly finished the window and moved to the next one, but his mind was racing. He'd just witnessed a woman trapped in the same gilded cage he'd fled, and unlike him, she couldn't simply walk away. The next morning, James found Victoria in the stables before dawn. She was in the foaling barn, crouched beside a mare who was clearly in distress, speaking in low, soothing tones. The stable manager, old Tom Garrett, stood nearby, looking worried. "She's been laboring for 3 hours, Tom said. "Foals breech. I've called Doc Patterson, but he's 40 minutes away." James set down his bucket. He'd grown up around horses. His family's Connecticut estate had stables, but he'd never let on that he knew one end of a horse from the other. Now, watching Victoria's hands move expertly over the mare's swollen belly, he made a decision. "I might be able to help," he said quietly. Both of them turned to stare at him. "You've done this before?" Victoria asked, her eyes sharp and assessing. James nodded. "A few times, if you'll trust me." Victoria didn't hesitate. "Tom, get more towels. You... Monroe, isn't it? Talk me through what you see." They worked together for the next hour, and James forgot to be careful, forgot to hide his knowledge. He guided Victoria's hands, explained the foal's positioning, helped her turn it while the mare labored. When the foal finally slipped free, wet and trembling, they both sat back on their heels, covered in sweat and birth fluids, grinning at each other like children who'd pulled off an impossible trick. "Where did a groundskeeper learn veterinary skills?" Victoria asked, washing her hands in a bucket. James hesitated. "I grew up on a farm. Small operation. We couldn't afford a vet for every birth." It wasn't entirely a lie, just not the kind of farm she'd imagined. "Well, thank God you were here." She looked at him properly for the first time, and James felt the weight of her attention like physical pressure. Her eyes were the color of Kentucky bourbon in sunlight, and there was an intelligence in them that made him want to tell her everything. Most people would have just fetched Tom and stayed out of the way. Most people haven't seen what happens when you wait too long for help that might not come, James said. Something shifted in Victoria's expression. No, I suppose they haven't. After that morning, Victoria started seeking him out. At first, it was about the horses. She'd ask his opinion on bloodlines or training techniques, and James found himself speaking more freely than was wise. But gradually, their conversations expanded. She'd find him working in the garden and sit on the stone bench, discussing everything from Khrushchev's ouster to the Beatles' American tour, to her frustrations with Kentucky's archaic business laws that made it nearly impossible for a woman to secure credit without a husband's signature. That's why Mother's so insistent on this marriage, Victoria said one afternoon in late November, watching James repair a section of fence. The autumn air was crisp, and leaves scuttled across the lawn. Without a husband, I can't expand the breeding operation. The banks won't talk to me. The other breeders treat me like I'm playing dress-up in my father's office. What would you do if you could? James asked, not looking up from his work. Everything. The word came out fierce. We have the best bloodlines in the state, but we're operating at a quarter of our potential. I want to build a second barn, bring in a trainer from Ireland, establish a racing syndicate. But I need capital, and capital requires credibility, and credibility requires, she trailed off bitterly, a man's signature. James drove another nail, anger burning in his chest. He thought of his own mother, brilliant and capable, whose opinions on Montgomery Steele were dismissed at board meetings, while his idiot uncles were taken seriously. The same cage, different bars. Have you told Theodore your plans? Victoria laughed without humor. Theodore thinks the breeding operation is a charming pastime. He's already told Mother he expects me to settle down after we have children, which apparently means selling most of the stock and turning the estate into a tourist attraction. Horse farm tours for bourbon buyers. And you're still going to marry him. What choice do I have? She stood abruptly, wrapping her cardigan tighter. This is how the world works, Mr. Monroe. Women like me can't just run away and start over. We don't have that luxury. She walked away before James could respond, but her words haunted him for days. She was right, of course. He'd had the privilege of walking away from his life because he was a man with a trust fund he could eventually access. Victoria was trapped by laws and expectations that no amount of money could overcome, unless someone helped her. December arrived with frost and the looming Christmas gala. The estate was transformed into something from a magazine spread. Evergreen garlands, imported poinsettias, crystal chandeliers cleaned until they sparkled like ice. James helped string lights and move furniture, watching the preparations with growing dread. This was where Victoria's engagement would be announced, where her fate would be sealed in front of Lexington society. 3 days before the gala, James was cleaning the conservatory when he heard voices. Theodore and Patricia, speaking in low tones in the adjacent sitting room. I'll need her to sign the papers before the announcement, Theodore said. Once the engagement is public, her lawyer might get difficult about the terms. What terms? Patricia sounded wary. Standard protections. The breeding stock transfers to Buckley Management after the wedding. We'll maintain the Hartwell name for marketing purposes, but operational control reverts to my family's agricultural division. It's cleaner that way. One management structure, no conflicts. James's hand stilled on the window he was polishing. Theodore, Victoria will never agree to that. The breeding program is her life's work, which is why we're not telling her until after the wedding. Theodore's voice had lost its smooth veneer, revealing something harder underneath. The prenuptial agreement is written in legal language that obscures the management transfer. Her lawyer will think it's about protecting assets in case of divorce, not about operational control. By the time she realizes what she's signed, it'll be too late. That's... Patricia hesitated. That's deceitful. That's business. Your daughter is brilliant with horses, Patricia, but she has no head for corporate structure. She'll thank us eventually when she sees how much more efficient the operation becomes under professional management. She can still play with her foals and feel important. Everyone's happy. James felt sick. He'd heard this kind of conversation before, powerful men discussing how to manage inconvenient women, how to neutralize threats to their authority while maintaining plausible deniability. His own father had used similar tactics to force James's mother out of company decisions. But he'd also heard something else. Theodore had just committed fraud. Contract law was contract law, and deliberate misrepresentation invalidated agreements. If Victoria signed those papers without understanding their full implications, she'd have legal recourse. The question was whether she'd fight, or whether she'd accept defeat like so many women before her had been forced to do. James made his decision. He found Victoria that evening in the library, reviewing ledgers by lamplight. The house was quiet. Patricia had gone to Louisville for last-minute gala preparations, and the staff had retired early. "Miss Hartwell," James said from the doorway, "I need to speak with you. It's important." She looked up, surprised. They'd maintained careful boundaries since their conversations in the garden, servant and employer, nothing more. For him to approach her here, in the private spaces of the house, was a violation of protocol. "What is it, Mr. Munro?" James closed the door behind him and crossed to her desk. His heart was pounding. Once he spoke, there would be no going back. He'd reveal himself as either a spy or a savior, and he wasn't sure which would be worse. "This afternoon, I overheard a conversation between Mr. Buckley and your mother. I wasn't eavesdropping intentionally. I was cleaning the conservatory. But what I heard, you need to know." He told her everything. Theodore's plan, the deceptive prenuptial agreement, the scheme to transfer control of her breeding program to Buckley management. Victoria's face went white, then red, then settled into a kind of frozen fury that James recognized. It was the look of someone realizing they'd been betrayed by people they trusted. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she asked finally, her voice carefully controlled. "You don't, but you can verify it easily enough. As to review the prenuptial agreement with your own lawyer, not the family attorney, someone independent. Have them explain every clause in plain language. See if the management structure matches what you've been told." Victoria stood and walked to the window, her back rigid. "Why are you telling me this? What do you gain?" James had prepared for this question, but the truth still felt like stepping off a cliff. "Because I've seen this before. Men using legal tricks to control women, to take what they've built and claim it as their own. I couldn't stop it then, but I can now. You deserve to know what you're signing." "You've seen this before," she repeated slowly. "What kind of groundskeeper has experience with corporate fraud? The kind who isn't really a groundskeeper." The words hung in the air between them. Victoria turned, her eyes searching his face. "Who are you?" James took a breath. "My name is James Montgomery. My father owns Montgomery Steel in Boston. I was supposed to marry Elizabeth Ashford. Her family owns Ashford Manufacturing, in a merger disguised as a marriage. Instead, I got on a bus and came here. I've been running away from the same trap you're about to walk into." The silence stretched. Then Victoria laughed, but it was edged with something sharp. "Montgomery Steel, I've heard of them. You're the missing heir." She sank back into her chair. "There were articles in the paper. Your father claimed you were traveling abroad. My father would claim I was on the moon if it protected the company's reputation." James moved closer but maintained a respectful distance. I'm not proud of running away. I should have fought, should have found a legal way out, but I was a coward and I left. I don't want you to make the same mistake, but I don't want you trapped either." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those sharp, bourbon-colored eyes. "Why horses? Why come here?" "I grew up around them. They were the only genuine thing in my life. They didn't care about my name or my money. When I saw your want ad, I thought I could disappear into something real for a while." He managed a weak smile. "Turned out I'm terrible at manual labor." "You're terrible at pretending to be terrible at it," Victoria corrected. "I've been watching you, Mr. Montgomery. You hold tools like they're props. You speak like someone who's had private tutors. You know things about bloodlines and veterinary care that no common laborer would know. I suspected you were hiding something. I just didn't imagine it was this. Are you going to turn me in?" "To whom? Your father?" Victoria shook her head. "I'm more interested in what we do about Theodore." "We." The word resonated in James's chest. "You could confront him directly," James suggested. "Or you could let him think the plan is working, sign nothing until you've had independent legal counsel review every document, and then sue for fraud if he's misrepresented the terms." "Or," Victoria said slowly, "I could call off the engagement entirely." "Your mother won't allow it, not with the gala 3 days away." "My mother doesn't control me as much as she thinks she does." Victoria stood and moved to the desk, pulling out a leather portfolio. "My father left me a trust that activates when I turn 25 or marry, whichever comes first. If I wait 18 months, I'll have access to capital without needing a husband's signature. It won't be easy. I'll face discrimination at every bank and business meeting, but it's possible." 18 months is a long time to fight alone," James said quietly. Victoria looked at him, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of two people who understood the same cage from different angles. "I've been alone for a while now, Mr. Montgomery. I'm getting used to it." But her voice wavered slightly, and James saw the truth beneath the brave words. She was exhausted from fighting, tired of pretending, desperate for someone to see her as more than a commodity to be managed. "You don't have to be," he said. The Christmas gala was everything Patricia had promised. 200 guests in evening wear, champagne flowing, the house transformed into a winter wonderland. James worked the event as part of the serving staff, invisible in his white jacket, watching Victoria navigate the crowd with practiced grace. She wore a green velvet gown that made her eyes luminous, and she smiled at Theodore's stories and laughed at the right moments. But James could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand tightened on her champagne flute when Theodore touched the small of her back possessively. At 8 o'clock, Patricia clinked her glass for attention. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for joining us on this special evening," Patricia began, beaming at the assembled guests. "As many of you know, the Hartwell and Buckley families have been friends for generations. Tonight, it gives me tremendous joy to announce the engagement of my daughter Victoria to Theodore Buckley III. They'll be married in June at Christ Church Cathedral, and we hope you'll all join us in celebrating their union." Applause filled the room. Theodore pulled Victoria close and kissed her cheek. Cameras flashed. Society reporters scribbled notes. James felt his heart sink. She was going through with it. But then Victoria stepped away from Theodore and raised her hand for silence. The room quieted, confused. "Thank you, Mother, and thank you all for your warm wishes," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly. "However, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Theodore and I won't be getting married." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Patricia's face went sheet white. Theodore's smile froze in place. "Victoria," Patricia started, "I've realized over the past few weeks that Theodore and I want very different things from life," Victoria continued, her voice steady despite the tremor James could detect beneath it. He wants a traditional wife, and I want to expand my father's breeding program into the finest operation in Kentucky. Those goals are incompatible. Rather than waste everyone's time with the engagement destined to fail, I'm ending it now." "You can't do this," Theodore said, his voice low and furious. "We have agreements, contracts." "We have a prenuptial draft that I haven't signed," Victoria corrected. "And after reviewing it with independent legal counsel, I've discovered several concerning clauses about management control that were never disclosed to me. I assume that was an oversight on your part, Theodore. Or perhaps your lawyers made errors. Either way, I won't be signing anything." Theodore's face flushed dark red. "You ungrateful—" "Choose your next words carefully," Victoria interrupted, her tone ice-cold. "We're in a room full of witnesses, and several of them write for newspapers. I'm sure they'd love a story about the Buckley heir losing his temper at a lady." The room was utterly silent. Theodore's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Finally, he turned and stalked toward the exit, pushing through the crowd. His parents followed, mortified. Patricia gripped Victoria's arm. "What have you done?" "What I should have done months ago." Victoria gently removed her mother's hand. "Excuse me, everyone. Please enjoy the rest of the evening." She walked out of the ballroom with her head high, leaving behind a room full of shocked guests and enough scandal to fuel Lexington gossip for months. James wanted to follow her, but he couldn't. Not here, not in front of all these people. Instead, he cleared glasses and listened to the whispered conversations that filled the room in her wake. Always knew she was difficult. Poor Patricia, to be humiliated like that. What kind of woman turns down a Buckley? She'll regret this when no one else proposes. James gritted his teeth and kept working, counting the minutes until the event ended, and he could find her. He found Victoria in the stables after midnight, sitting in the hay beside the mare they'd saved together. The foal, now 2 months old, slept curled against its mother. Victoria had changed out of her gown into riding pants and a sweater, and her carefully styled hair was coming loose from its pins. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen, or the most foolish," James said from the doorway. "Probably both." Victoria didn't look up. "Mother's locked herself in her room. Half our friends have already called to withdraw their support. Theodore's father threatened to sue us for breach of promise, though his lawyers will realize quickly there's no legal basis. And I've destroyed my reputation in one evening. So, yes, perhaps foolish is the right word." James sat down beside her in the hay, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Or perhaps it's the first honest thing anyone's done in that house in years." "Honesty is expensive." Victoria's voice was bitter. "I'll pay for this for a long time. Every business meeting, every negotiation, every time I need something from someone, they'll remember the night I humiliated the Buckley family in front of Lexington society, the woman who couldn't keep a man. Or they'll remember the woman who refused to be controlled," James countered, "who stood up for herself when it mattered. That's the kind of person I'd want to do business with." Victoria finally looked at him, and her eyes were wet. "You don't understand how this works. For men, independence is strength. For women, it's just difficult, unmarriageable. I've branded myself, James. I'll spend the rest of my life fighting twice as hard for half the respect. Then don't fight alone." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Victoria shook her head. "You can't save me. That's not how this works either. You're running from your own problems. You can't take on mine too. What if I'm not running anymore?" James turned to face her fully. "What if I'm ready to stop hiding and actually fight? Not for my father's company, I don't care about that. But for this, for you, for the chance to build something real instead of inheriting something hollow." "You've known me for 2 months, Victoria said, but her voice was softer now, uncertain. "I've known you long enough to see who you are when no one's watching. I've seen you save a foal at 3 in the morning. I've seen you stand up to Theodore's condescension and your mother's control. I've seen you risk everything to stay true to yourself. 2 months or 2 years, that's who you are." Victoria was quiet, her fingers twisting in the hay. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "What are you suggesting?" James took a breath. This was it, the moment where he either stepped forward or stepped back, where he chose truth or continued hiding. "Stay here. Keep fighting for your breeding program. When you turn 25 and the trust activates, use that capital to expand. And let me help, not as some secret benefactor or hidden partner, but openly. I'll go back to Boston, face my father, break the engagement to Elizabeth properly. I'll take whatever legal consequences come from that. Then I'll come back here and we'll build this together. A partnership, equal stakes, equal say." "You'd give up Montgomery Steele for horses?" Victoria sounded incredulous. "I'd give up Montgomery Steele for freedom. The horses are just a bonus." James smiled slightly. "And maybe for the chance to know you better, without the pretense, without hiding." Victoria studied his face for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the most insane business proposal I've ever heard. Is that a no?" "It's a you're out of your mind, but I'm listening." She wiped her eyes, and a hint of her earlier strength returned. "You'd really go back? Face your father?" "I'd rather face him than keep running, and I'd rather fight with you than hide alone. This won't be easy," Victoria warned. "Even with capital, we'll face discrimination. Banks will question every decision. Breeders will assume you're the real owner and I'm just decoration. People will say terrible things about why we're working together. Let them talk." James reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, and he wrapped both his hands around hers to warm them. "I'm tired of living according to other people's scripts, aren't you?" Victoria's breath caught. Then, slowly, she smiled. A real smile, not the practiced one she wore for society. Exhausted. They sat together in the hay as the foal stirred and the mare shifted in her sleep. Outside, the night was cold and clear, stars visible through the stable windows. Everything had changed in one evening, and nothing was certain except the risk they were about to take. But for the first time in months, James felt something other than fear. He felt hope. James returned to Boston 3 days after Christmas, and the confrontation with his father was everything he'd expected. Shouting, threats, lawyers, and finally a cold ultimatum. Come back to Montgomery Steele and marry Elizabeth, or be disinherited completely. James chose disinheritance. The legal proceedings took 4 months. His father fought every step, trying to prove James mentally unfit or unduly influenced. Elizabeth's family sued for breach of promise. Society pages ran scandalous stories about the Montgomery heir who'd abandoned his duty for a horse farm. His mother called once, weeping, begging him to reconsider. "I'm sorry, Mother," James had said, "but I can't live the life you and Father chose for me. I have to live mine." "You'll regret this," she'd whispered. "You'll be poor, unknown, no one." "I'd rather be no one authentic than someone false," James replied. He meant it. By May, he was legally free. No claim to Montgomery Steele, no trust fund, no connection to the family name except what he carried in his memories. He had $12,000 in personal savings, a law degree he'd never wanted, and Victoria's letter in his pocket confirming that her trust had activated on her 25th birthday. He also had something he'd never had before: choice. James returned to Lexington on a humid afternoon in late May, the bluegrass already green and lush with early summer. He'd written to Victoria weekly throughout the legal proceedings, and she'd written back, first cautiously, then more openly, sharing her plans for the breeding program and her frustrations with obtaining business loans as a single woman. "I got one bank to agree to a meeting," she'd written in April. When I arrived, they assumed I was there to open a household account. When I explained about the expansion loan, they literally laughed. I wanted to set the building on fire. Try the Farmers Trust on Main Street, James had suggested in his reply. Ask for Robert Chen. He's new in town, trained in California, and his bank specializes in agricultural lending. Tell him James Montgomery recommended you. If he asks who that is, explain I'm the idiot who gave up a steel fortune for horses. He'll either think we're both crazy or worth the risk. Victoria had gotten the loan. Now, as James walked up the drive to the Hartwell estate with his single suitcase, he saw the construction already underway. A new barn rising beside the old one, its frame skeletal against the sky. Workers moved across the structure, and he could hear the rhythmic sound of hammering. Victoria stood near the construction, wearing trousers and boots, her hair tied back, reviewing blueprints with the foreman. She looked up as James approached, and her face transformed. Shock, then joy, then something more complicated that made his heart race. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would." James set down his suitcase. "I'm a man of my word. Also, I'm unemployed and homeless, so I was hoping the position of junior partner might still be available." Victoria laughed, and it was the most genuine sound he'd heard in months. "Junior partner? After giving up an empire? I figured I should start at the bottom and work my way up, build some character." James moved closer, aware of the construction workers watching with interest. "Also, I've been thinking. We discussed a business partnership, but we never actually formalized terms. I was hoping we could negotiate." "Negotiate?" Victoria raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Montgomery?" James pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. "A partnership agreement. 50-50 ownership, equal decision-making authority, shared profits and losses. I've included provisions for dispute resolution, expansion protocols, and succession planning. It's all very legal and boring." Victoria took the document, scanning it quickly. Her expression softened as she read. "This is fair, more than fair. You're giving me equal control even though you're contributing capital. You're contributing the land, the existing stock, the breeding expertise, and the reputation. That's worth more than money." James paused. "There's a clause on page 3 you should read carefully." Victoria flipped to page 3. Her breath caught. The clause read, "In the event that the partners marry each other, all assets shall remain jointly owned, with no automatic transfer of control or management authority to either party. This partnership shall supersede any marital property law that would otherwise apply." She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "James, I'm not proposing," he said quickly. "Not yet, not while everything's so uncertain. But I wanted you to know, if someday, when we're ready, if we decide to be more than business partners, you'll never have to choose between your work and a relationship. I'll never ask you to give up control. I'll never trick you or manage you or diminish what you've built. That's a promise, legally binding." Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she held the document. "You really thought of everything. I had 4 months and several expensive lawyers." James smiled. "Also, I've been thinking about this since the night you turned down Theodore. About what a real partnership could look like, one built on trust instead of control." "This is insane," Victoria said. But she was smiling now too. "We barely know each other. You've been a groundskeeper for 2 months and disinherited for 4. I've been publicly humiliated and branded difficult. We're going to face constant scrutiny and criticism. People will assume the worst. They'll say I seduced you for your money, which you don't have anymore, or that you're using me to rebuild your reputation. They'll whisper that we're scandalous or inappropriate or worse." "I know," James said, "and I don't care, do you?" Victoria looked at the construction site, at the new barn rising from her vision and determination, at the workers building something that would outlast both of them. Then she looked back at James, And something in her expression shifted, a wall coming down, a decision being made. "No," she said softly, "I don't care either." She signed the partnership agreement right there, using the construction foreman's clipboard as a desk. James signed below her, and they shook hands formally while the workers whistled and applauded. "Welcome to Hartwell Farms, Mr. Montgomery," Victoria said. "Thank you, Miss Hartwell." James held her hand a moment longer than necessary. "I promise not to kill any more hedges." "I'll hold you to that." The first year was brutal. They worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, learning everything about breeding operations, bloodline management, and agricultural business. James discovered muscles he didn't know he had, and developed calluses on his hands that his father would have found appalling. Victoria negotiated with suppliers, trained new staff, and slowly built relationships with other breeders who'd initially dismissed her. Patricia remained distant, still furious about the broken engagement and what she saw as Victoria's reckless decisions. But she gradually warmed when the breeding program started showing profit, especially after their yearling sold at auction for 3 times the expected price. "Perhaps you know what you're doing after all," Patricia admitted grudgingly over Christmas dinner. "Perhaps," Victoria agreed, not bothering to hide her satisfaction. James's family never contacted him. He heard through mutual acquaintances that his father had suffered a minor heart attack and that the business was struggling without a clear heir. He felt a pang of guilt, but it was distant. Someone else's problem, someone else's life. This was his life now. Early mornings in the stables, late nights reviewing bloodlines, stolen moments with Victoria where they'd talk about expanding into racing or breeding for specific temperaments. Their partnership was professional and effective, but beneath the surface, something else was growing, a connection built on shared values, mutual respect, and the kind of trust that only comes from working side by side through genuine hardship. They were careful not to rush it. Neither of them was interested in creating scandal or giving critics ammunition, but James noticed the way Victoria smiled when he brought her coffee during late-night planning sessions, and she noticed the way he automatically looked for her when he entered a room, as if his internal compass pointed toward her. By their second summer, the farm had expanded to 40 horses, and they'd hired a full-time trainer from Ireland, a gruff woman named Siobhan, who knew more about equine behavior than anyone James had ever met. The breeding program had a waiting list of clients, and Victoria's reputation in the industry was solidifying from difficult woman to brilliant breeder. It was a humid evening in July when everything shifted. They'd just finished a successful auction in Louisville, and they were driving back to Lexington in James's new truck, a practical purchase, not the luxury cars he'd grown up with. The radio played softly, some new song about California dreaming, and Victoria had her window down, her hair whipping in the wind. "I've been thinking," James said, keeping his eyes on the road. "Dangerous pastime," Victoria teased. "About us. About this partnership." He took a breath. "It's been 19 months since I came back. 19 months of working together, building this together. And I think I've been in love with you for at least 18 of those months. Possibly longer. Maybe since the morning we saved that foal together." Victoria went very still. The wind rushed through the open window, and somewhere a truck horn blared. Finally she said, "Pull over!" James pulled onto the shoulder, his heart hammering. Had he misread everything? Had he ruined their partnership with his feelings? Victoria turned to face him, and there were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. "You idiot. I've been in love with you since you risked your cover to save that mare, since you chose honesty over hiding, since you walked away from everything to come back here." "Oh," James said, his voice rough. That's good then. Very good." Victoria reached for his hand. "But I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we make this more than business, I still won't give up control of the breeding program. I still won't be anyone's decorative wife. I'll still fight with banks and breeders and anyone who tries to diminish what I do, and you'll have to be okay with people talking, with them assuming you're the real boss or that I'm just lucky to have you. I know, James said, and I'll tell them they're idiots every single time. I'll correct every assumption. I'll make sure everyone knows that Hartwell Farms is yours, that I'm just lucky enough to be your partner in every sense. Victoria kissed him then, and it was nothing like the chaste kisses he'd exchanged with Elizabeth at chaperoned events. This was urgent and real, tasting of salt and summer, and promises they were finally ready to make. When they broke apart, breathless, Victoria said, "We should probably discuss logistics." James laughed. Ever the businesswoman. Someone has to be practical. But she was smiling. We'll need to be strategic about this. The engagement, the wedding, it can't look rushed or scandalous. We'll need time for people to accept us as a couple, not just partners. How much time? 6 months, Victoria suggested. A proper courtship, dinners in public, church attendance, all the respectable things that will bore us to tears but make our union acceptable to society. And then I marry you, and we prove everyone wrong who said it would never work. Victoria's eyes sparkled. A spring wedding, small, just family and close friends. Reverend Morrison can officiate. He's forgiven me for the Theodore disaster. And then we expand the breeding program and take over Kentucky racing and live happily ever after. That's quite a plan. I'm good at plans. Victoria kissed him again, softer this time. Especially when they involve you. They were married in April 1967, in a small ceremony at the estate. Patricia attended, finally reconciled to her daughter's choices, and even seemed to approve of James once she saw how the farm was thriving. Siobhan gave a toast that was half Irish blessing, half warning to James about what would happen if he ever diminished Victoria's work. Robert Chen came from the bank, along with several other breeders who'd come to respect Victoria's expertise. James's family didn't attend, but he hadn't expected them to. The reception was held in the new barn, now complete and housing their finest breeding stock. They danced to records on a portable player, ate barbecue from the best joint in town, and toasted with bourbon that Theodore's family had produced, an irony that made Victoria laugh until she cried. "To partnerships," she said, raising her glass, "the kind built on trust." "To honesty," James added, "and new beginnings." Then they clinked glasses, and their friends cheered, and somewhere in the crowd, someone started singing "Stand By Me," which seemed fitting for everything they'd survived to get here. That night, after the guests had left and the barn was quiet, James and Victoria walked the property together. The spring air was soft and warm, carrying the scent of grass and horses and possibility. "Do you regret it?" Victoria asked quietly. "Giving up Montgomery Steele? The fortune? The prestige? All of it?" James thought about his answer. 2 years ago, he would have been uncertain. Now, looking at the farm they'd built together, at the woman who'd chosen him not because she needed him, but because she wanted him, at the life they'd created from courage and stubbornness and love, the answer was simple. "Not for a second," he said. "This is real. Everything before was just performance, and I'm done performing." Victoria squeezed his hand. "Good, because we have a lot of work ahead of us. The racing syndicate, the expansion into training, maybe a few foals of our own eventually." "Foals of our own?" James raised an eyebrow. She flushed. "I meant the humankind. Someday, if you want." "I want everything with you," James said seriously. "The farm, the fights with banks, the long days, the hard work, and yes, someday, children who'll inherit not just property, but the knowledge that they can choose their own path, that they're not bound by other people's expectations. We'll teach them to be honest," Victoria said, "and brave, and stubborn, especially stubborn. James pulled her close, and they stood together in the darkness, surrounded by the sounds of horses settling for the night and the promise of all the mornings yet to come. They'd both walked away from the lives they were supposed to live, James from his inheritance, Victoria from her arranged marriage. They'd both risked everything to build something authentic. And now, standing on land they'd paid for with determination and love, working side by side as true equals, they'd found what neither had expected, not just freedom, but partnership, not just independence, but belonging. The kind that came from choosing each other day after day in the hard work and the quiet moments, and the battles they fought together against a world that wanted to diminish them. And if that wasn't a happy ending, James didn't know what was. 3 years later, when their daughter was born, fierce and loud and perfect, they named her Eleanor after James's grandmother, the one person in his family who told him to follow his heart. And when their son arrived 18 months after that, they named him William after Victoria's father, whose dream they'd expanded beyond what he'd ever imagined. The children grew up in the stables, learning about bloodlines and business, about honesty and partnership, about standing up for what you believed even when the world told you to sit down. They watched their mother negotiate million-dollar deals and their father support her without ever trying to take credit. They saw a marriage built on equality and respect, where both voices mattered, where compromise didn't mean surrender. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, James and Victoria would sit on the porch and watch the sunset over the fields they'd built together. And they'd remember that winter night when everything had changed, when he'd stopped pretending and she'd stopped accepting, when they'd both chosen truth over comfort and found each other in the honesty. "Best decision I ever made," James would say. "Marrying me?" Victoria would tease. "No, getting on that bus to Kentucky. Everything else just followed." And Victoria would laugh and rest her head on his shoulder, and they'd sit together as the stars came out, grateful for the courage it had taken to reject the lives they were supposed to live in favor of the one they'd chosen. Together.